The Falcons are expected to put a franchise tag on tight end Kyle Pitts. We'll break down why it's the safe but ultimately wrong choice for the Atlanta Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, which is now the #1 sports podcast network in all of the galaxy. And if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black. I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we're talking all about the potential for the Falcons to franchise tag tight end Kyle Pitts. We'll break down why we expect the Falcons to ultimately do it, why it makes sense, and why it's a safe choice for 2026, but why it's not necessarily in the best interest for the Falcons long term, and why a tag doesn't necessarily guarantee that Kyle Pitts is on the roster in 2026, as we'll explore the potential for a tag and trade, and why Pitts doesn't really fit the long-term vision of building this Falcons offense around Drake London and Bijan Robinson over the next 5 or so years. But as many of you are listening to this on Tuesday, February 17th, this is the day when the window opens for when NFL teams can tag players in pending free agents as franchise tags, as well as transition tag. We're not going to necessarily get into the transition tag unless we need to, right? If the Falcons decide to zig where we expect them to zag and apply the transition tag, then we can break down the differences between the franchise tag and the transition tag. But over the next 2 weeks, right, which ends on March 3rd, where the deadline for when teams decide to franchise tag players happens. And typically teams will wait until within 24 hours of that deadline to officially make the tag. But sometimes teams do it early. But it seems like the world seems to expect the Falcons to tag Kyle Pitts, right? We've heard from Jonathan Jones of CBS Sports, Jeremy Fowler of ESPN, as it's sort of national people, insiders and whatnot, that have basically written over the last week that they expect and they likely see the Falcons tagging Kyle Pitts. And we've also heard from local beat writers such as Josh Kendall of The Athletic and Mark Raimondi of ESPN, and I'm sure others that I'm forgetting, that have also expressed the expectation that the Falcons are likely to tag Kyle Pitts. And, it makes sense why the Falcons would do that. It's the safe choice, right? As we've discussed many times on this podcast over the last few days and weeks, that 2026 is very much an evaluation year. Now, we talk about it usually in the context of evaluating the quarterback and Michael Penix and whatnot, but it truly applies to the entire roster, and Kyle Pitts is part of that roster. And so you want to kind of evaluate Kyle Pitts in the Kevin Stefanski offense rather than sort of projecting him in the Kevin Stefanski offense and making a decision about his future. And so you will get that by tagging him. He comes back for another year. And then in 2027, you can make a more informed decision about what Kyle Pitts' future in Atlanta is, whether that exists or whether or not you keep him or let him go next offseason. And you're essentially just punting that decision to 2027 when you can make a more informed decision. So it makes sense. There are pros and cons to, that choice, right? The pro of that is obvious, that you have Kyle Pitts back for another year, coming off an all-pro season, hoping to see him, repeat that success in 2026. Right. And obviously that provides somewhat a boost to the Falcons offense. We can debate how much of a boost Kyle Pitts' presence provides, but it's certainly a non-zero boost, right? You're getting something out of Kyle Pitts, right? And we can talk about how Kyle Pitts achieved his production this year in terms of his all-pro status. That probably was a benefit of having a bunch of injuries at the wide receiver position. But even when you had Kyle Pitts operating alongside primarily Drake London, not so much Darnell Mooney, but when Drake London was healthy, Kyle Pitts was still like 20% of your offense. So that's 20% of your offense you potentially could lose and would need to replace this upcoming season by letting Kyle Pitts walk. Now, the main con of tagging Kyle Pitts is the money, right? $16.3 million is the projected franchise tag for tight ends, according to Over the Cap. We'll get an official number once the NFL sets its actual salary cap And we right now have it's like a $4 or $5 million range in terms of what we expect that to be. And I think 16.3 is like right in the middle of that projection. But if you spend $16.3 million on Kyle Pitts, that's $16.3 million you can't spend elsewhere. And that's the main con against this. It doesn't sound like, and none of the various insiders and beat reporters seem to be suggesting that Kyle Pitts is likely to sign a multi-year contract this offseason. And we can talk about what a multi-year contract could be for Kyle Pitts in terms of his market. I would guesstimate that it starts at about $18 million a year because that's what 2 franchise tags would cost the Falcons. That's usually how agents factor in how much they can get on a multi-year contract when there are players on the tag, because he's not going to necessarily be able to reach the open market in order to test that actual market value. But $16.3 million this year on the tag, and then 120% of that value in 2027 for a second consecutive tag would be about $19.6 million. So that adds up to be roughly about $36 million over the next 2 years, and that's where that $18 million a year figure comes for. And that would potentially make Kyle Pitts the 3rd highest paid tight end in the NFL, behind George Kittle at $19.1 million per year and Trey McBride at $19 million per year. But if Kyle Pitts was able to hit the open market, that would probably potentially drive up the price even higher, to the point that he could be the highest paid tight end in the NFL and making something closer to $20 million per year. But in terms of that immediate money that the Falcons are losing, in terms of the $16.3 million, they're losing over half of their cap space, approximately 60% of their salary cap space in 2026 as we sit here today, based off of over the cap's projections of about $26.5 million that the Falcons have currently in their cap space. They can obviously create more cap space by cutting players and restructuring contracts and whatnot. But, $16 million is not nothing when it comes to money that you can no longer spend, right? That even if the Falcons do create more cap space, there's still $16 million with tagging Kyle Pitts that they can't spend, because they have to spend that on Kyle Pitts. And that's essentially 3 Divine Diablos. Like when you look at Divine Diablo's cap hit in the first year of his 2-year contract that he signed last year, was approximately $5 million. And $16 million would be 3 Divine Diablos worth. So you could, in theory, with the money that you're paying Kyle Pitts this year on the franchise tag, pay 3 mid-level free agents the same cost that you're paying Kyle Pitts. And certainly, and again, that's not a knock on Divine Diablo, but he's not necessarily the highest paid linebacker in the NFL at that cost. And he was like $7 million a year, which is mid-level in NFL free agency standards. But, 3 mid-level free agents like a Divine Diablo could short 3 other spots. And, that's essentially the con of tagging Kyle Pitts, where it's like, well, we could boost 3 other roster spots rather than boosting this 1 roster spot. But, when we talk about tagging Kyle Pitts, there's another reason to justify tagging Kyle Pitts, which is not because you plan on keeping Kyle Pitts, is because you actually plan on trading Kyle Pitts. And we'll explore why the Falcons would do that, because it allows them to control the outcome of Kyle Pitts' future in terms of compensation versus letting him walk. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons.
Hey, it's Matt Derry from the Locked On Lions podcast. The people I love depend on me. If I'm gone, the financial responsibilities don't disappear. I didn't want my family figuring things out during the hardest moment of their lives. That's why I knew only one place to go. I chose life insurance through my friends at Ethos. Ethos makes getting life insurance fast and easy, 100% online. You can get a quote in seconds, apply in minutes, and get same-day coverage. There's no medical exam. You just answer a few simple health questions. You can get up to $3 million in coverage. Some policies are as low as $30 a month. I love the folks at Ethos. Protect your family with life insurance from Ethos now by going to ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. In as little as 10 minutes, you can get the free quote and up to $3 million in coverage at ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. That is ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. Ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. Application times and rates may vary.
So before we continue today's episode, I want to shout out the everydayers who make this illustrious podcast their first listen each and every day. You are the reason why Locked On is now the #1 sports podcast network in all of the galaxy. And we know that the offseason does not exist for the everydayer, especially if you are part of our new Everydayer Club. Join the group chat for Locked On Falcons year-round and get every episode of the show ad-free by going to the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. It's just $5 a month or $50 a year. So go check it out. So you've heard me say on this podcast several times over the last 6 weeks that I think it's smarter for the Falcons to let Kyle Pitts walk. The main reason, if you've missed those episodes, is I think by keeping Kyle Pitts, you're kind of doubling down on Terry Fontenot's, let's call it, problematic team building methodology, which, involved over investing in the tight end position that you could justify back in 2021 when we didn't know the things that we know now, but it's a lot harder to justify that in 2026, especially when you're arguably going to be paying Kyle Pitts twice as much money as you were paying back in 2021 and now in 2026, because Pitts' rookie deal averaged about $8 million a year. And we're talking about, a price tag that starts at $16 million and could potentially exceed that. And as we often say on this podcast, and we've said many times in talking about various strategies that the Falcons have been employing over and over again for the last few years that have proven futile, is the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, and sort of keeping Kyle Pitts and expecting it to dramatically change and improve. This time it's going to be different. It's like, all right, I've basically, as you guys well know, I've been hearing that for the better part of a decade. It's like, this year it's going to be different. And it's like, sure it is. Every year y'all say it's going to be different, but it isn't different. But, we'll make another argument later in today's episode that's loosely based on that, because Kyle Pitts doesn't really fit into a future of the Falcons offense that revolves around Bijan Robinson and Drake London. But another reason that isn't necessarily the main one for letting Kyle Pitts walk is that you potentially get a comp pick in 2027 for him, right? That if you let Kyle Pitts get to the open market, he's going to maximize his contract under another team, and that's going to maximize your chances of getting a premium comp pick in 2027, which probably at the very least will be a 4th round pick, if not a 3rd round pick. And for those of you that don't quite understand how the compensatory pick formula works, and we're not going to necessarily get into the nitty gritty of it, because I'm hoping to get a guest on the podcast between now and the start of the league year that can really break this down. But a basic overview is that when unrestricted free agents sign with another team, the original team gets compensated with a future draft pick in a not so secret formula. So if Kyle Pitts signs with a new team this year in 2026, the Falcons will get compensated with a draft pick in 2027. And as we've mentioned before, because this year is kind of an evaluation year, those picks are more like a 3rd round pick in 2027, I think, is more valuable than a 3rd round pick in 2026, because you can make a more informed decision in 2027 with the usage of that 3rd round pick than you can in 2026. But the problem with letting Kyle Pitts walk and leaving it up to the chance of the compensatory pick formula is that you don't have as much control that you actually get that compensation, right? Because there's the potential that if you sign another free agent, it could cancel out the compensation that you could be headed your way for Kyle Pitts departing, right? Even if they aren't on equal deals. And this happened back in 2023, I believe, for the Falcons, or 2022. Yes, it was 2022, where the Falcons signed Casey Hayward to a $5.5 million a year deal, which based off the comp formula would have been worth a 6th round pick, right, for his previous team. But that canceled out the 3rd round pick that the Falcons had coming their way from letting Foye Oluokun walk that same offseason to Jacksonville. And Foye Oluokun walked for a $15 million a year deal. So even though they weren't quite equal, they kind of canceled each other out. And so then again, we're not going to get too deeply into that, because I do want to have that future conversation. I want to save that conversation for a future podcast episode. But there are basically, as I understand it, 3 main workarounds to avoiding that sort of situation where you lose out and they cancel out. You either need to sign players that have been cut by their previous teams. Those players do not count towards comp picks. Or you need to sign players too close to the veteran minimum. And I feel like it's about $2 million or less per year. Typically does not qualify for the comp pick formula. Typically, again, I don't know that exactly to be true. Or you have to wait until after the draft in May to sign free agents after a specific date, and they no longer count. And none of those are ideal outcomes, because basically if you tried to do that with Kyle Pitts, you'd be bark and bin shopping, going back to the previous point of like, oh, well, we can sign 3 Divine Diablos with the money we save on not tagging Kyle Pitts. But now if you're trying to manipulate the comp pick formula, you're not signing Divine Diablos, because you know that's going to cancel out any, comp that you get. And so you have to not get that. So you're kind of that even though you're freeing up money, you're not really being able to use that money is basically why that. And so even if you do sign players for, $1 million or whatever, very unlikely those players are going to move the needle for you in a positive way. So those savings don't really benefit you. And that brings us to the point of a tag and trade, right? This is one of the reasons if you don't want to pay Kyle Pitts and you do want to move him, if you tag and trade him, you actually control the outcome. You're essentially in this circumstance, if you're successful at trading him, you guarantee that you're going to get some compensation for him rather than leaving up to chance by playing the comp pick formula game, right? And it's very likely that you'll get a similar return as you would get on a comp pick, a third or fourth round pick in a trade. Maybe you get something more thrown in there to sweeten the pot or whatever. Obviously, you would probably get those picks in 2026 versus 2027, but you're getting something as opposed to being stuck with nothing, right? And, I think the challenge for the Falcons, if they do decide to go down this path, I don't think you can just simply go willy-nilly about tag and trade, right? That, it's like, oh, we're going to tag Kyle Pitts and then we'll just see what happens, right? Like, I think if you're going to tag and trade Kyle Pitts, you kind of have to go into these next 3 weeks knowing that's what your ideal outcome is going to be. And you need to make it known for all parties involved that that is what you're seeking in this circumstances, because I think that maximizes the chance that you get a team offering you compensation, because teams have money to spend at the beginning of March in that opening wave of free agency, that as we get past that first wave of free agency, which this year is going to end around March 13th, I believe, is the Friday after free agency begins, where spending usually drops off a cliff that weekend. They're going to be less inclined to trade for Kyle Pitts because they're not going to have the money that they need in order to absorb that $16 million franchise tag. And then the $16 million the Falcons wind up freeing up, the later it goes in the offseason, the less valuable that is, because, all the good free agents are gone. And those, players that you could have signed in the first wave of free agency with that $16 million you freed up, you don't get that opportunity. And so to me, the way that would work is tomorrow or today, Tuesday, whenever you guys are listening to this, and the deadline opens up, you go to Kyle Pitts, you go to his representation, David Mulugheta, and you basically say, yes, we're going to tag you. We don't really plan on giving you a multi-year contract unless you're going to give us a hometown discount. We're going to be upfront with you about that. And if you want to get that multi-year contract, you are free to shop yourself around without being penalized for tampering, right? Teams can basically say that to a player in the next 3 weeks before the league year starts, to see if you can get a multi-year deal from another team. And then on top of that, we'll try to negotiate a trade with that team in terms of your preferred choice. But obviously, ultimately, if you negotiate a deal with, let's say the Broncos, and they only want to offer a 6th-round pick, like, we're not going to do that, right? But we got to both figure it out. But the longer you give that leadway, that run up to that situation, the more likely it is you'll find a way. And it works for all three parties. The Falcons get the benefit of freeing up that cap space and getting the compensation. Obviously, Kyle Pitts and David Mulugheta benefit because they get the max deal that we know that they want, and 99% of players want. And then the new team benefits because they can now sort of budget for Kyle Pitts at the beginning of the year when they have their most money, as opposed to trying to make it work in April or May or June or July or whatever, when it's less likely to work for those teams. And so I think the tag and trade is just something that if that's going to be something the Falcons actually explore, you can't just basically be like, oh, we'll figure it out later, right? It's something that I think, even though it may not be guaranteed to get done in March, and it may wind up happening in April or May or July or whenever, it's more likely that it's going to happen in March. And so you want to go into the offseason trying to facilitate that. And as I said, it works for all parties, especially if you can get that done ASAP as soon as possible, rather than having that lingering going into the draft cycle, lingering going into the summer cycle, and all that stuff. And so if that does wind up happening, we can certainly explore that topic more and look at the history of teams that have successfully tagged and trade players and whatnot. But, that I think is another reason to justify actually tagging Kyle Pitts, so that you have control over your compensation, as opposed to leaving it up much more to chance by playing the comp pick formula. So that is also an option for the Atlanta Falcons if they do decide to go down that road. But as I said earlier, I don't think, keeping Kyle Pitts long-term is the smartest decision for the Atlanta Falcons. I think long-term thinking, you don't necessarily want to tie yourself to Kyle Pitts, because I think when we're thinking long-term about what the best version of the Stefanski-led Falcons offense looks like, Bijan's part of that. Drake London's part of that. But I don't think Kyle Pitts quite fits into that vision, and I'll explain why as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So the pressure is high in the NFL, and it is also high in your workplace with deadlines, overflowing inboxes, and that one position that you have to fill that's sitting open. When that pressure is on, you need the right hire, and Indeed is all you need. Indeed sponsored jobs is going to help you reach the right people who actually fit what you're looking for with the right skills, experience, and location, so that you're not just hoping the right candidate stumbles across your post. Over the next minute that I'm talking to you, companies like yours will have made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with Indeed sponsored jobs. You can get a $75 sponsored job credit by listening to this podcast to help give your job that premium placement it deserves. Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? This is the job for Indeed sponsored jobs. Now, if you've ever wanted to experience the NBA Finals live and in person, now you can, because FanDuel is going to give you your chance to turn that dream into a reality with their NBA sweepstakes. Here's how it works. You just use your profit boost on any NBA future, and you'll automatically be entered for a shot to win an NBA Finals trip for two, with flights, tickets, the whole experience taken care of for you. And if you're already looking at the board and thinking about which team do I feel like is going to make that deep run, right? Now's the perfect time to lock it in, right? The futures bets always after the All-Star breaks makes it a little bit more interesting, because it's always more fun to watch that team actually make that push for a championship or the conference title. It's going to add an extra layer of excitement down the stretch. And now not only can your pick win you some cash, it can also send you to see that team in the final. So visit FanDuel.com to get started. Use your profit boost on an NBA future and get entered for your chance to win a trip to the NBA Finals. Play your game with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So again, I've stated several times before on this podcast that Drake London's going to get paid. And in case it's not clear like it is before, it should be clear now. Bijan Robinson is also going to get paid by this football team. We're not going to necessarily do a deep dive into why they're going to get paid on these on today's episode. We'll just take it at face value that this is a reality that we're living in. The main reason, without getting into the nitty-gritty, is both of these guys are young and in their prime. They're both 24 years old. They're going to be the centerpiece of this offense for the next 3 to 5 years. With Bijan being a running back, it's 3 to 5 years in terms of his prime. And then with Drake London being a wide receiver, it's about 5 to 7 years of his prime. Now, obviously, Kyle Pitts is also in the prime of his career as well. But the problem with Kyle Pitts is Kyle Pitts doesn't really complement those guys. Now, the case for why he doesn't necessarily complement Bijan Robinson is pretty simple. It's twofold, right? The tight end that complements Bijan Robinson is a guy that's going to help him out a lot more than what Kyle Pitts brings to the table as a blocker. Now, Kyle Pitts, I think his blocking has been underrated by folks the last couple of years, but we know that Kyle Pitts is not an impact blocker in the ways that you ideally want in terms of complementing a running back like Bijan Robinson. And then the other issue that Kyle Pitts clashes with Bijan is, they're competing for checkdowns, right? And checkdowns are a normal function of the tight end along with running backs. We talked about this 2 years ago, where Kyle Pitts, one of the biggest boosts that he would have 2 years ago when Zach Robinson was hired and being utilized like a normal tight end, which would be a lot more underneath targets. You saw that really manifest itself this year as opposed to in 2024. We know that all tight ends benefit from these underneath targets. I've seen data that basically half of NFL tight ends production come on these sort of underneath sort of throws in between under 5 yards in the air. And the challenge with after you pay Kyle Pitts, whether it's on a franchise tag or a long-term deal, is you need to justify that by funneling those underneath targets to Kyle Pitts in order to pad his stats, right? So if you're trying to, if you're paying Kyle Pitts a certain amount and like you're expecting a guy that's going to catch 5+ balls a game, probably 3 of those, on average need to be checkdowns. And the knock against it, again, I'm not trying to sit here and like this is the end of the world or anything like that, but if you're going to check the ball down, you want to check the ball to Bijan, right? Because Bijan's going to give you a lot more on those plays because of his ability to create after the catch than what Kyle Pitts is going to do. And so when it comes to Drake London, right, and essentially paying Kyle Pitts means you're going to have to force targets to Kyle Pitts. You're going to have to go out of your way. And again, going out of your way is probably a little bit hyperbolic, but like you're going to have to make an effort to funnel targets to Kyle Pitts. And it's like, we don't want to sit here and work too hard, right? We want this to be easy and natural, and sort of other tight ends you won't feel as compelled. Basically what I'm saying is if you had a cheaper tight end in that position, you wouldn't feel compelled to funnel targets to that guy. If that guy gets targets, great. If he doesn't get targets, whatever. We're paying him $3 million. We're paying him $5 million. No one cares, right? But if you're paying that guy $16 million, or, in the future on a long-term deal where Kyle Pitts is counting $20+ million against your salary cap, you're going to feel obligated to have to funnel those targets. So that's what I mean where, that is an issue. When it comes to Drake, it's been well documented over the last 4 years that when Drake is eating, Kyle Pitts usually isn't. And when Kyle Pitts is eating, Drake is usually not, right? Now, I've always sort of been pushing like, oh, there's a world where you can get both of these guys to work in your offense, and it behooves the Falcons to try to find that formula, but they haven't really had a lot of success, especially recently, right? I remember talking about this after Drake's rookie season back in 2022, where Kyle Pitts got injured and there was a huge spike in production for Drake London in those final 5 games, and primarily because the Falcons started featuring Drake London a lot more in the slot in those 5 games. And as we've discussed many times over the last 4 years, Drake London's primary value and what makes Drake London special is he's one of the best power slots or big slots, whatever you want to call it, in the NFL. And that clashes with Kyle Pitts because Kyle Pitts is essentially also a big slot. More on that later. But we saw in 23 and 24, as Drake London continued to blossom, Kyle Pitts' production kind of stagnated. Injuries and other factors were related to that. But we saw particularly Drake have his best year in 24. And that was also the year where Kyle Pitts was an afterthought. So it's like you have 2 guys going in opposite directions, right? And then again in 2025, right? In the first 5 games of this past season, both Drake and Kyle were decently productive. But again, the bulk of Kyle Pitts' production early in the season really came on checkdowns. Like 70% of his catches were, throws of 5 yards or less. Right. And then week 7 happened. The Falcons play the 49ers. That was Kyle Pitts' sort of breakout game, his best game. We gave him flowers on the podcast to talk about. It's great that Kyle Pitts is producing. But the other thing that happened in that game is Drake London was virtually a no-show. That was basically his least productive game of the season prior to his knee injury, which happened several weeks later. Drake misses the Miami game and then goes off the 3 games after that point. And that coincides with the dip in production that we saw from Kyle Pitts, where he had several sort of consequential drops over that month-long period between the 49ers game. And then we get to the Carolina game. Drake gets injured at the end of that game. Then we see, starting in that week 13 matchup against the Jets, a big spike in Kyle Pitts' production, and that spike continued for the rest of the year. But that was also the stretch of the season where Drake London was either out of the lineup or later in the season clearly not playing at 100%. And so Kyle Pitts continued to be the featured weapon. So you have this clear dichotomy that plays out over 4 years of like Drake eats, Kyle doesn't. Kyle eats, Drake is usually not part of the offense, right? And so it's hard to imagine a world where both of these guys are eating at the same time, right? You go back and look at that 8-game stretch where we saw the best version of Drake London from week 4 to week 11 before his knee injury, right? And you look at Kyle Pitts' rankings among tight ends in terms of production, in terms of yards per game, he was 14th. In terms of target rate, which is basically the number of targets you get per route that you run, he was 36th among tight ends, right? And so essentially, again, that's not poor production, but like that's closer to league average production for a tight end than necessarily high-end production. Then you look at Kyle Pitts in those same metrics after, from week 12 on, after Drake London got injured and exited in the lineup and basically was a non-factor for the rest of the season. Pitts' yards per game among tight ends jumped to 3rd. His target rate jumped to 6th. And so we basically have 5 games across 4 years where both of these guys have been on the Falcons roster, where both guys have had 60+ yards in the same game. And I use 60 yards because essentially if you average, 59 or like 58.9 yards, so we'll round up to 60. If you average that over 17 games, you'll get 1,000 yards in the season. And so those 5 games are the 23 game against Houston, the 24 game against Tampa Bay, of course. Kyle Pitts always eats against Tampa Bay. It's just a question of, well, Drake will eat. 24 game against Carolina, the 24 game against Seattle, and then this past year's game against Washington. And those 5 games represent less than 10% of the 55 games that these two guys have played together over the last 4 years. And that averages out to be about 1.5 games per season. Now, you can absolutely argue that Kevin Stefanski should be able to outshine his predecessors in terms of incorporating both of these guys in the offense. He had some success with David Njoku and Amari Cooper in his offense from 2022 to 2024, right? Those guys played 32 games together, and 7 of those games featured them getting 60-plus yards in the same game. That represents about 20% of those games. So twice as good, right? Or 2.5 times as good, I think, when you ultimately average up. So that averages up to be about, if you round up to about 4 games per season. And so I sit here and I go that, even if you get that number to 5 games, right? Is it really worth it to really build your offense around a pair of weapons that only are going to complement each other for at most a quarter or a third of your games, rather than trying to build a group that complements each other for the vast majority of your games? I think that's going to be a challenge for the Falcons. And again, the main reason why Drake and Pitts don't really work well together is both are ideally big slots, right? And it's really hard to feature 2 big slots in the same offense. Instead, the Falcons should be building a complementary receiver core around Drake London, who we can sit here and say should be here for the foreseeable future, and bring guys in that do all the things that Drake London doesn't do at a high level. And there's really nothing that Kyle Pitts does at a reasonably high level that Drake London isn't equally as good at or better at, right? If you're looking for a vertical threat, like Kyle Pitts is one of the best vertical threats for tight end. But it's a better, vertical threat than a vertical threat tight end? A vertical threat wide receiver, right? You need to get a yak monster that can do that, create after the catch that Drake isn't necessarily good at. And Kyle Pitts is just okay after the catch by tight end standards. And of course, a wide receiver that is dynamic after the catch is going to be far better than just an okay tight end, right? And so you want to also get guys that can shine outside, right? Because again, Drake is going to live a lot as that sort of slot receiver and get moved all around the formation. And you want to have guys that can win outside. Now, Pitts can win outside. We've seen him do that, but it's primarily just like fade balls down the sideline when he lines up outside. And we know that Drake London can do that just as well, if not better, because Drake London is a much better contested catch guy than Kyle Pitts is when it comes to those things. And so, relative to tight ends, Kyle Pitts is one of the best outside the numbers vertical tight ends in the NFL. If we look at 15-plus yard throws outside the numbers over the last 5 years combined, Kyle Pitts is top 3 in yards and receptions amongst tight ends. But there are 38 wide receivers that are also ahead of him, right? And that's based off of volume, right? The fact that we're talking about 5 years of total numbers, right? If we factor in per game averages, right, the yards per game on those outside the number vertical throws, there are 6 tight ends ahead of Kyle Pitts, 5 active. Gronk is also ahead of him over that 5-year span. And there's like 60 wide receivers that are ahead of Kyle Pitts. And so essentially what I'm arguing is that even the thing that you say, oh, that's unique about Kyle Pitts relative to the tight end position, right? Relative, his value as a tight end is no different than, say, a number 3 wide receiver is, right? With 60 plus, total wide receivers, which is almost 2 per team, right? Almost every team averages 2 per game. And in the Falcons case, both Darnell Mooney and Drake London are top 32 in that metric in terms of outside the numbers over the last 5 years per game, right? So you have 2 of the better options in that regard relative to the NFL at the wide receiver position, and one of the better options at the tight end position. But, compared to the wide receivers, basically what I'm sitting here saying is a wide receiver is more valuable than Kyle Pitts at this point in time. So use those resources on a wide receiver rather than investing them in a tight end. And that gets to the core of why, like I sit here in 2021, we thought it was a new era. The tight end was going to blossom in the NFL. And we've seen successful guys like Brock Bowers and Trey McBride, and we've seen Kyle Pitts have some success, but now in 2026, we kind of know that, building your offense around the tight end, probably not for everybody. For certain teams, yeah, sure. The Chiefs and Travis Kelce, sure. But, at this point, hoping that Kyle Pitts is going to turn into Travis Kelce. Again, we had that vision in 2021. That was a big reason that drove why Kyle Pitts was so valued in that 21 draft class, because Travis Kelce was just coming off this monster year in Kansas City. And we're like, this is the new direction of the NFL. But now 5 years later, we're like, okay, no, that was just Travis Kelce. That's not the new direction of the NFL. And so, again, I think tagging Pitts makes sense if you're just trying to wait and see. But the reality probably is that, even if you punt that decision to 2027, is anything going to change dramatically over the next calendar year? Probably not, but we'll see. And so that's why I say it's like the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and again and expecting a different result. But we'll see what happens with Kyle Pitts in future. Do the Falcons tag him? Do the Falcons extend him? Do they tag and trade him, or do they let him walk? We'll be talking quite a bit more about that over the next 2 weeks as we approach that franchise tag deadline. But tomorrow's episode, we will be talking more about the coaching losses and Mike Rutenberg and Jerry Gray, and talking about how big those losses are. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On NFL. And if you are an everydayer that never misses an every podcast episode, the Everydayer Club is for you. Get Locked On Falcons ad-free, plus a members-only Discord and more. Head on over to lockedonfalcons.supercast.com with a link in the description to join the club. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.